Hello, everyone. My name is Jacqueline Coté, and I'm the Director of Public Relations here at the Institute. And it is my real pleasure to welcome you this evening to a very special event. Now, first of all, this is a special room for most of you, and the idea is to have a bit of an intimate conversation with our speaker. That's the idea. This event has been organized by the Institute in partnership with the Club Diplomatique of Geneva, and I thank them for their support and also for organizing for you all a small drink after the event, where hopefully we'll be able to have a little bit more insight from our speaker on a one-to-one basis. If my memory is correct, we met 15 years ago, Achim. We met when you were the Director General of IUCN, and in fact, you interviewed me. Maybe you didn't remember that, but I certainly remembered. What I remember was somebody with a twinkle in his eyes, a big smile, and the ability to find connections. And I think this is a factor that he has brought throughout his tenure at IUCN, and then, of course, 10 years at UNEP, and now as administrator to UNDP. Finding the connections, bringing the parties together, and promoting sustainable development. Now, it's almost a year today, maybe not quite, that you've been with UNDP. And what you also are, and I've discovered that looking at your official bio, is that you're a vice chair of the UN Development Group, and that is quite a formidable task as well, because that unites 32 UN funds, programs, specialized agencies, and other bodies that work to support sustainable development. So Achim has been a vocal advocate of the SDGs, and I hope some of the comments that will be made tonight will also cover this particular aspect, but of course, international cooperation, sustainable development. And he will reflect on the role of multilateralism and how a repositioned UN development system can support in addressing global challenges. So I don't know whether you would like to come here and be very formal, stay where you are and have a conversation with Professor Biersteker, but we have the pleasure of having with us one of our seasoned professors, Tom Biersteker. He's a professor of political science and international relations at the Institute. He's been working in these areas for a very long time, and he will be challenging Achim or asking him friendly questions, I don't know, but you'll discover with me. So there will be time for questions, for Q&A afterwards, and I hope you enjoy this special evening. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jacqueline, for that introduction. Can you all hear me easily? Okay, good. I'm not sure about the acoustics. We don't always get a chance to use this room, so it's my pleasure to be with you this evening, and my pleasure also to be asked to moderate this event. In a very informal conversation at the door, we decided to abandon the agenda on the program, which was presentation of remarks by Achim Steiner, and we're just going to have a conversation. So we'll start with a few questions. I must say I had the advance, it was helpful that your staff provided me at least some talking points that you might have used, but it provoked a whole series of questions, comments as I was looking through them. So why don't we just start with that? And we'll talk for a while and then open it up to conversation and contributions from everyone here present. So if that sounds like an adaptation and change right away, let me just take other couple of points. A very general point, I'll start with, and then I'll move to what we said we would talk about. But given your extensive experience working on global environmental issues during your tenure as Executive Director of UNEP, I'm curious about what are some of the both institutional or lessons or experiences that you bring from that position now to the UNDP, that you bring from the global environment domain to the domain of global development, and then we'll move on to multilateralism and other things. But I'm curious at the outset, just some initial reflections on your part on that.
Well, thank you, Thomas and Jacqueline, for the kind introduction. Good evening to all of you. And I thought at this time of the afternoon to speak at you is probably not as attractive an idea as if we go into combat, perhaps over some ideas, and later on with you also. Because really in coming here today, I'm reaching out as UNDP head right now and trying to explore essentially an outlook on what is happening in terms of development. What is the future of development? And I'll come back to that in a little moment, perhaps in the context of the question that you might ask about multilateralism. But let me briefly say one of the things that connects my time in the United Nations Environment Programme with now the UN Development Programme is essentially a closing of the circle. My reason when I left university, I was essentially focused on being a development economist. And very quickly, as I began to work in the field and around the world, it became obvious to me that the whole development discourse was remarkably blind to the unfolding sustainability challenge. Whether you call it environment sustainability, whether you refer to it as natural resources, conservation, resource scarcity, climate change, it was just remarkably one-eyed, so to speak. And I, happened to, at that time, I was working in Pakistan in a rural development program, and by sheer coincidence, in the mountains of northern Pakistan, came across this organization that then eventually led me to work here in Gland, which was IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which remarkably in the 1980s, together with WWF and UNEP, had published Caring for the Earth, no, the World Conservation Strategy, I think it was that way around, which articulated a much more intelligent view of development in the sense that sustainability mattered. And the years that I then later, from 2006 to 2016, spent in Nairobi leading the United Nations Environment Programme, were already characterized by a different understanding of how environmental change was fundamentally affecting the development prospects of nations. Climate change clearly being the most prominent way in which that was beginning to manifest itself. You might remember Lord Nicholas Stern's famous report in which the cost of inaction emerged as a fundamental reference point in this domain. And so my time in Nairobi was already moving far beyond an environmental advocacy era of environment. I mean, when NGOs in the 60s, the Rachel Carsons and so on, began to open our eyes to what was happening, it essentially was a society and an economy that didn't want to take note of it, didn't take it seriously. By the time I was in Nairobi, the world was beginning to take environment much more seriously as a public policy issue, but also as an economic issue. And so the convergence onto where I find myself now is, in one sense, logical, because I began my professional pathway as a sustainable development professional with a focus on sustainability, and in UNEP very much then began to look at the link also between economy and environment, partly out of a frustration that the environmental movement was not growing up fast enough, commensurate with its potential influence, by not engaging in an economic public policy discourse. Out of that arose the work on the green economy, the economics of ecosystem and biodiversity, and in that sort of trilogy of initiatives, also the inquiry into green finance, three kind of seminal pieces of work that try to move beyond an environmental economics narrative and actually challenge the core of economic dogma, if I may put it that way, with the evidence about what environmental change implied and how sustainability would increasingly influence what happens next. And finding myself today leading UNDP after the General Assembly adopted the 2030 Agenda of Sustainable Development Goals, in that sense is a very natural progression. Now, in the battle of how these three dimensions interface, depend on one another, has been won. I think that is not the battle of our generation or of our age anymore. The question now is, how do you transform, transition our economies, our societies into this 21st century mode of operating? And leading UNDP at this particular moment in time, which is the UN's development program, that has as its mandate, beyond any individual sector a view of how to help countries identify the choices and pathways for their development, in that sense, seemed to me to make a lot of sense. And at least a priori to the Secretary General when he invited me to come back to New York. Yeah.
Interesting. It's interesting to reflect on the extent to which we've come such a long way from what was at one point historically considered a tension between development versus environmental protection, and now has become usually almost the change in language, the introduction of the ideas of sustainable development that then created the possibility of now making it central to development goals in and of themselves. One point, and I'm now reflecting on what you might have said publicly if you'd followed the talking points. You begin early on with a reference to the challenging setting, and it's relevant to the concluding remarks you made a moment ago about the possibilities for 21st century focus on the development of, and the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, but it's being undertaken in a very challenging context of multilateralism, and changing multilateralism. In some ways you made reference to the contemporary, I think it was a phrase, I think you invoked it from the Secretary General about discontent and anxieties in the rust belts of the world, creating a challenge to multilateralism. But I would actually posit that if you look back, we can already see the movement away from formal intergovernmental organizations, even before the recent developments in populist movements and challenges to multilateral engagement, because we already have the creation of a large number of informal intergovernmental organizations like the G groups, and rapid explosion in the number of transgovernmental initiatives involving public and private actors in different forms and different ways. And this is all linked, as another point you raise in your reflections, or in your talking points, is the decline in government support for either assessed contributions or support for formal intergovernmental organizations. How has UNDP, or how is it adapting or changing over time to this relatively difficult environment? And I refer not just to the emergence of populist anti-internationalism, but away from reliance on looking to formal intergovernmental organizations for a variety of perhaps potentially less permanent institutional forms.
I would first perhaps challenge the notion that in the narrative of the politics of the day, indeed there is a much greater skepticism, critique of multilateralism, of institutions. But in the reality of how our world works today, multilateralism is literally the spinal cord of how we interact with one another. I mean, if you look at the full range of UN organizations, how letters reach one end of the world to another, how planes fly across borders, how we deal with pandemics, how we are trying to address even things such as the internet, which initially were deliberately kept out of the sphere of multilateralism, and over time, even ICANN surrendered, and we looked at a more, let's say, equitable form of governance for the internet. And you could go on. I mean, here in Geneva, human rights and the Global Fund, the response to AIDS. We rely on the United Nations system every day for virtually every aspect of what is considered a global community, whether in trading terms or whether in communication terms or in containing risks. And yet, you're right. I think the willingness to invest in the mandate of the United Nations system to deliver on these purposes has become more contested. Countries have become also more skeptical about how effective their money is being used. And you've had, over time, an erosion of funding. Part of that, however, I think is a domestic political phenomenon, including here in Switzerland. And in parliaments, in a public debate, money that goes to the global good and the abstract UN is increasingly being questioned. And so there is a tendency to reduce core financing, to tie more funding. And in an organization that I stepped into with UNDP last year, I was astonished to find that only 13% out of the total financing that UNDP transacts is actually core funding. And it's fundamentally flawed to then talk about accountability and governance, because how on earth are you held accountable for a mandated set of things you're supposed to do by your governing board when 9/10 of the funding that you have is equivalent to donors walking into a Walmart and buying something off a shelf and walking out again? Oh, I want you to do a project in Lebanon, or I want you to do a project in Malawi. So we have reached, and this is not only in UNDP, but across organizations, a kind of loss of the social contract that was there between nation states that fund the UN for things that it wants it to do. Alongside that, you've certainly had the emergence of other arenas. I mean, civil society, regional integration, also creating new platforms. And, it's not by accident that the G7 meets in Canada, and in Shanghai another meeting takes place. That new development banks arise out of the inertia in the old development banks to change their governance. So civil society, the private sector, regional emancipation, and also a shift in the development paradigm. What used to be in the 60s and 70s the dominant view of development was that the state, governments, the governance and regulatory frameworks would essentially define the outcomes in development. And then, we swung almost to the other extreme, where government was by definition an obstruction, a disruption, and it was markets and the private sector that would deliver intelligent development choices. I think we've, in a sense, like a pinball machine, you sort of find yourself in this process. Where we are today is in a state of confusion. And the world is losing confidence in its own institutions, norms, standards, and rules it has established over the last 50, 60 years. And the UN is simply part of that overall phenomenon of not knowing whether you really want to continue believing in it, investing in it, or whether you're looking for something else. And I think we are caught up in that much bigger maelstrom.
I think the idea of a loss of the social contract is a very important insight. The ways in which the obligations, the commitments, and it's difficult to know how that gets reconstructed. I mean, how practically, you talk about engagement of other types of actors. I mean, how do you do that? How do you do that effectively, and how do you maintain accountability when you have actors from the private sector, not all acting in a benign way, sometimes with a very strong interest in certain kinds of outcomes? So how do you address the accountability challenges that come with these kinds of partnerships and new types of governance arrangements?
Well, let's first of all remind ourselves that, the last few years have seen a significant cancellation of social contracts also with large corporations. The debates we're having right now here in the heart of Europe about taxation of multinationals, the implications of what it means to be Apple, Amazon.com, or whoever else, and not de facto pay taxes, has given rise to a very interesting debate. So I think we are facing challenges by people who I think are not essentially opposed to globalization. What they are responding to is a sense of having lost their sovereignty. Much of the last decade and a half, we have lived in a narrative of globalization that basically says you either play by the rules of the market or you're out. And much of the global rules and norms that led to deregulation, liberalization, and so on, in one sense produced a wonderful bonanza of suddenly low-cost airlines and banking fees going down and other such things. But it also produced a reality that many people over time began to react to, and yet they were told, well, that's how it is. And I think when we look at the role of the private sector in the years to come, what we are seeing right now, I think, is a period of emancipation of the people who were considered to be marginal to what happens next. The majority of the less educated, rural communities, the unemployed, those who are not the beneficiaries of globalization. And not to overinterpret it, but across Europe, North America, but even in countries in the global south, a degree of political polarization, nationalism has re-emerged that I think is partly a product of this era. And this is where I think when we talk about the future of development, I feel a deep sense of discomfort right now, because we are sitting in a city where the architecture of multilateralism is actually testimony to a terrible, tragic failure last century, on the back of which, we paid a terrible price. And right now, we have similar tendencies emerging, where nationalism, national interest, jingoism, rhetoric is beginning to challenge fundamentals of a global international order. Now you might say, well, maybe it's overdue, we need catharsis. And you ask me, what would trigger, in a sense, a change? I think in part, yes, catharsis sometimes is the way to move forward. The problem is we live in a world where we really can't afford to have catharsis, because it's a damn dangerous world in which to experiment with crises. And I think part of the UN's ability to re-establish its relevance in public perception is what the Secretary General is attempting to do with UN system reform at the moment, that sense of, here is a calcified international organization that needs to evolve. But I think it is also by engaging with countries and the public on topics that matter. And here I would simply say, we can talk about the SDGs in our conference room like this, and we all know what we're referring to. And I often say, the SDGs to me are like an operating system in an iPhone. You don't need to understand it to use it if you know how to use the apps. And what we are right now confronting with is, if you go into the street and start talking about 17 SDGs, yes, people will look at you and say, what are you talking about? But if you relate the 17 SDGs to what people are discussing, which is, I'm worried about the next Ebola attack and who is actually going to help protect us from it. I'm worried about poverty because clearly migration is beginning to be an issue we can't cope with. I'm concerned about automation and inequality that is creating a kind of structural unemployment in my community that I just don't want to see. And very quickly the SDGs emerge or re-emerge as a very interesting agenda in exactly what they try to do, which is unify us in our ability to deal with these issues. I think that's part of regaining a social contract, a confidence, a trust, and leadership. Yeah.
I want to come back to the SG's reform agenda in a minute, but one point in your interesting talking points about the future of development is a reference to the need to bring regulation back, in a sense, to bring regulation back to save globalization from itself. And you alluded to that just a moment ago in talking about the pendulum swinging back and forth. And I think it's a very, very important point. I mean, critics of globalization early on, or critics of neoliberal reforms, observed the importance and need to maintain a certain minimum level of regulation. It can't simply be reliance on the market mechanism in order to, even to make institutions function. And to some extent, this point has been lost sight of over the last several decades, but it requires both, I would say, well, both political will, political engagement, political mobilization. And where should this discussion take place? Where, in what institutional fora, and who should provide leadership in this process? Is this the special role for UN organizations today?
Well, in my previous position in UNEP, evidence-based policy work was very fundamental, and UNEP was, by definition, very much a science and evidence-based institution that brought to the attention of the international community. And I see Philippe there, so I mean, he was both advocate, recipient, victim, and propagator of that discourse. Evidence about the need to act, the imperative to act on factual basis. So I think one part of it is that the UN is, and if you look at the amount of data and reports that the UN produces and how often they are cited, it is one of the reference points in our world of understanding what is happening. And the UN Human Development Report that we produce is remarkable in that it has 128 million downloads. It's the most downloaded report on development in the world. I mean, the World Bank's World Development Report apparently follows at 65 million. So, there is very much an interest both for data, for analysis, for empirical evidence that the UN has, let's say, a brand and a trust that it can build on. I think beyond that, you very quickly run into this challenge of it is in the end the public that leads and not politicians. I mean, we sometimes have the fortune that we have a political leader who steps out of the comfort zone and provides real leadership. But most of our elected political leaders are essentially followers. I mean, they follow public sentiment, they follow polls, they follow, things that they deem to be acceptable or make them re-electable. So the starting point for any change, I think, and in a sense also an assertion of governance, as I would call it, rather than just government, is that the public believes in it. And here we do come to the origins of a social contract, which I think is an important concept. And Carlos Lopez, who some of you may know, interesting enough, immediately at the end of the Rio +20 summit, together with some Brazilian colleagues, organized a very interesting debate about the loss of social contracts in our society. So the public needs to have the confidence that in empowering parliaments and governments, we make choices and that those choices are transacted by government. And who would want to live in a society today of essentially libertarian anarchy, so to speak, in the kind of economy that we know, full of inequalities, enormous disruptions, monopolies, transfer pricing? We don't. We want to have a degree of regulation. We want, a rules-based framework within which we can operate. We make social choices. I mean, Switzerland is a particularly experienced country in using, in a sense, the public to make rules of the game. And I therefore think what has changed is that we have moved on from a debate about the state will fix it to the markets will fix it, to actually markets function within a set of choices that the people who constitute it make. So it is not about government so much, it's more about governance. And how do we govern our societies in terms of economic choices, economic freedoms, limitations, be it taxation, be it laws, and the prohibition of asbestos, for example. If you had asked the companies who own buildings, they would have said, no, never, we can't afford to get rid of asbestos. And yet we make a choice at a certain point and we ban it, and then we say we're going to close a building until the asbestos is removed. So right now, I think we don't have a return of the regulatory, mother state. I think what we have is a recognition that we need governments to transact the kind of choices that reflect our norms. And the frontier of technology is going to be a very interesting one in the coming years. And with the extraordinary possibilities of automation, a simple taxation challenge. Do you tax a robot at the same rate at which you tax a human being when they do the same piece of work? At the moment, we don't. We live in this bizarre world where we punish people who work with the highest taxation rate, and capital owners who own a piece of equipment called the robot taxed at a fraction of that rate. Does that make sense in a world in which unemployment is a phenomenon that we are dealing with all the time? And you can extend that to licensing certain well, platforms that exist globally, but when it comes to child pornography, we have decided that the internet isn't just an open free space in which anything goes. But we've lost control of it to some extent because it has moved to a point where even national regulators cannot control it. And the prospect of cybercrime is an entirely new phenomenon. And again, multilateralism becomes in part a way of addressing it.
And Geneva is actually an important location for these kinds of conversations and discussions. I mean, you talk about the promise of technology, the challenges of technology, the pace with which the change is taking place, the automation. I think your point about robots is particularly well taken because the existing system creates a set of incentives to replace labor with machines.
I must actually credit Bill Gates, who last year came up with this example, which I thought was very poignant as an illustration of the distortion.
Mm-hmm. And it's a real challenge, I think, in many different domains. I mean, in talking about technology, it's not just the internet. It's actually artificial intelligence. The number of different institutional manifestations of this transformation that we're going through at the moment. But it falls generally under the category of IT for good, which sounds like yes, of course. Let's see how it can be used this way. But how do we ensure that IT is directed to developmental purposes or to the SDGs? There's a lot of, among my scholarly colleagues, there's a lot of interest right now in studying algorithms, the algorithms as a form of governance. I mean, who writes the code, who writes the programs for artificial intelligence, who's making these decisions? Because these decisions have consequences, and they have the people who write it may have some specific purposes in mind. They may have some unintended things they've never even thought about as this is developing. So, it's interesting, you talk about digital technologies promoting access to information and improving transparency, and that's all very much to the good. But some algorithms are written actually to help control access to information in the name of typically not national but state security. So, like electronic identity schemes, in many ways, as important as they can be for development goals, could also be a very double-edged sword. So how do we regulate or navigate this terrain? Like
most things that human beings either discover or invent, in due course they can be used for good or for evil. And I think it's interesting. There is a new book by Jeremy Hymans, one of the co-founders of Avaz, who I think it's called New Power. I've just begun reading because I met him last week, and we were discussing this phenomenon of how power through technology and platforms, the digital universe, has begun to shift, and in turn has caused also different manifestations of power. Some of them can be Cambridge Analytica. Some of them can be undermining democratic processes, and others can be e-government, making government much more accessible, much more effective, much more efficient. Some of it can be biometric registration. I was in Zimbabwe just a few weeks ago, and there UNDP is helping to establish probably the best voters register in its history, because we brought biometric registration equipment, and 5.7 million people are now registered with biometrics. And you cannot, at least not that easily, manipulate it. So you point to algorithms. I think in the last year or two we've had a number of very interesting instances being described in literature of how algorithms are first of all, yes, not only capable of being flawed or manipulated, but can also become part of an exaggeration or a distortion phenomenon in the way they then evolve. So this is where regulation is important, because part of the challenge is that in this universe of technology, and particularly when we move into AI, it is virtually impossible for a normal human being to even question this anymore. The notion of transparency almost ceases to exist. So unless you can create a regulatory environment that allows you to still step in and establish rules at the point in which these technologies are emerging, and you're able to also regulate a market, unless you do that, you probably lose control and you will not be able to catch up. And I personally think in this year in Oxford that I spent last year was to me an eye-opener. We have, I think, as normal people in the public, no conception of quite what this age of artificial intelligence will imply. It will change the way most things that we know and are familiar with will take place. And it's an extraordinary prospect. And I think it was, to me, fascinating to see that the companies that are at the forefront of some of this artificial intelligence began to get so nervous that governments were not paying attention to it, that a year and a half ago, Amazon, Google, I don't know if Apple was part of it, about 5 or 6, established their own think tank, NGO platform, in order to catalyze a debate about the regulatory framework that would be needed in order to deploy these technologies. I mean, this is how fascinating an age we live in, where companies themselves are so conscious of the fact that if you don't have regulation, a license to operate and established, you may face extraordinary risks and backlashes. So I think it's a good illustration of that interface.
It's also, I think it's also an interesting example of in certain issue domains, because of the high threshold for knowledge about the technology, we have, in effect, private authority in global governance. When it comes to the decisions of, if you wish to remove your name from a website, the codes, the regulations governing that are entirely determined by groups of private companies, not by states, not by internet, not yet anyway. I want to turn things over to the engaged audience here. We've already occupied all the time allocated for your presentation and my questions. So, I just have one I might conclude with, though, which refers to, you've already alluded to it, the repositioned United Nations Development System. This is, I'm making reference to last Thursday's UN General Assembly consensus that the SG referred to as the most ambitious and comprehensive transformation of the UN development system in decades. And beyond the idea, the core of separating resident coordinators from UNDP resident representatives, I mean, how will this change work in practice? What are the implications of this change for UNDP? And a related question, one of the estimates, this is from the official UN news release last week on this, from the Secretariat, estimated that this reform will cost $255 million annually. Where will the money come from?
I'm not sure I can answer the last question, but my Secretary General and Deputy Secretary General assure me it's in the bank. So, no, I say this because it is indeed an outcome that was not intended by the Secretary General, because the reform was meant to be something that would be embedded in the so-called regular budget of the Secretariat of the United Nations. So that basically, you know, every year, as part of the financing of the UN, you would also finance the resident coordinator system. Now, just to take a step back, Secretary General set out with a very ambitious reform agenda, because it was also the mandate on which he believes he was elected, UN system reform, in the domains of peace and security, in the domain of the UN development system, and in management. The UN development system reform is the one that has now advanced the furthest, and central to that is a notion of how do we move the system to one, being more in line with an SDG logic rather than an MDG plus, as Amina Mohammed would say if she was here. How do we reduce some of the duplication and overlaps and also infrastructural presence that, you know, does not make sense sometimes, where too many agencies are present in a country, sometimes with just 1 or 2 people. Can we find better ways of integrating? And can we also rationalize back office operations, you know, the clustering, the joint services? And can we develop the United Nations Development Assistance Framework, the so-called Undp planning tool, into something that is more aligned with the objectives of joined up implementation and financing? Now, as with every reform, you know, you start here and you end up here. We have moved from having a very ambitious UN development system reform package to having a development system deal. This is multilateralism. The United States refused point blank to have $1 from the regular budget finance the resident coordinator system. Many felt that UNDP hosting this coordination function had outgrown its purpose and therefore needed to be separate. And the Secretary General wanted to have that coordination function for the system located in the Secretariat, directly reporting to him. So the dilemma is, if you take the system as it was, UNDP, with its extraordinary presence across the world, I mean, it has a greater presence than any other development agency around the world, 170 countries in 130 full-blown presences with resident coordinators, you essentially had a 2-for-1 deal. You had the resident representative, and on top of that, they provided the coordination function. Now, you separate that system. You need 2 people. You need a staff, also professionals to support the resident coordinator, and you have the logistics of operating a freestanding system. It is also one that has been increased in terms of the number of staff. So it used to be about 560. Now it will be 1,195 people from the resident coordinator to the office that supports that system in New York, to the staff that will be sitting with the resident coordinator in each office. And so, once you add up all of this, you arrive at this figure that indeed is, quite significant, 255 million to run a coordination system. Now, the Secretary General said that's less than 1% of the total development finance you put through. Doesn't it make sense to have that? Well, in this day and age, the debates and the views vary, but it is now a decision. For UNDP, it's a very critical moment because, in a sense, it had gotten very familiar and used to operating these dual functions. It now, in a sense, delinks that functional coordination and is full-time focused on the development advisory support that it was set up for, because it is, as the title says, the UN's development program. I think for me, who arrived just about a year ago, the opportunity of trying to rethink the role of the UN's development program in this era of SDGs, freed from what often had become an issue of controversy and jealousy, and was UNDP benefiting from being also the coordinator function in the system, in some ways seemed to provide also an opportunity. Freed from that whole narrative, UNDP could now focus on providing the kind of advice that we were looking for in the SDG era, because it is the only entity in the UN system that is not sectorally focused or issue focused. It is the offer of the UN to assist the country in its development path and choices. Evolving that model was part of the discussion with our board and the strategic plan, because I fought very hard against, first of all, this notion that UNDP was sort of a rest-sum game for the UN of LDCs plus some fragile states and countries in crisis, and should not really engage with middle-income countries. To me, it was a fatally flawed assumption, because the argument that ODAs for least developed countries actually overlooked the simple fact that if you're looking at development as an answer to many of the challenges and risks that now define our era, then not only would development be something that, through the SDG logic, is a fundamental proposition by which to engage, most of the biggest risks are actually centered around middle-income countries. And the world's poor are largely found in middle-income countries. The greatest environmental risks that we face today, whether just from a pure ecological point of view or also from a geopolitical and resource management point of view, happen to be in the middle-income countries. The biggest health risks and pollution risks are there. So thankfully the board agreed that in fact the UN's development program should be accessible, and interestingly enough, a fifth of the total turnover of UNDP today is actually countries paying for the services of UNDP. There is no other development agency that I'm familiar with that has proven itself as, let's say, hard-nosed in terms of a market test as UNDP has. It's $1 billion in fees that countries from Argentina to Brazil to Senegal to Kazakhstan to the Emirates pay in order to secure input from UNDP. And so the trajectory in moving forward is, yes, we will have 3 development settings. Poverty focus, those countries that are still emerging out of an LDC life and reality. Structural transformation, which is more the countries that are going through major changes in terms of infrastructure, energy systems, industrialization, but sometimes face very basic development challenges on inequality, on poverty, and crisis settings, in which UNDP is actually a very prominent player together with our humanitarian agencies. And also to signal that, first of all, I think the future evolution of UNDP needs to be far more along the lines of moving from being a development aid agency in the traditional sense of technology funding, experts from the global north, capacity building, to being a development advisory partner, helping countries to face the challenge of whole-of-government responses where you have the onslaught of technology while still dealing with a rural economy where millions of people might be living in poverty, infrastructure needs, and educational sector needs. SDGs and that framework are ideally suited to help governments make complex choices. The systems approach to development becomes the core of UNDP's offering, and innovation in its broadest sense is actually the business we're in. And I keep on saying to staff in UNDP, 95% of you work on the front lines of development in countries alongside our partners to address problems. So by definition, you're looking for solutions, and innovation is your business, but the whole organization is not set up today in a way to actually take advantage of its greatest asset, which is that it actually has people with finger on the pulse of national development innovation in 170 countries. Our challenge today is not to run a knowledge bank, it's to create the connectivity that allows instant access to cutting-edge best practices across a broad range of issues that are embedded in national development planning, choices and strategies. And I think, looked at it from that vantage point, the reform is, first of all, yes, a challenge. It disrupts a system with a number of ambitious hypotheses about what should be better in due course. But it also puts into UNDP's radar a different view of itself in the years to come. And I accepted this position because I think in the UN family, the UNDP function and role are actually foundational to a development system being able to operate. And some of that will go to very basic things about, backbone services. But what the Secretary General has actually put at the center of his reform agenda in moving forward vis-à-vis UNDP is the integrator role around the SDGs, the platform around which countries, UN agencies, not to be coordinated, but come together to solve problems with the international community. And in that sense, our role becomes increasing that of a development lab, if you want. Much more agile, much more focused on the cutting edge, much more systemic in approach, but being able to deploy yourself with multiple actors onto specific problems. And in that context, funding obviously becomes an issue, because if the cost of reform is now to essentially defund agencies, funds and programs in the development system in order to fund a coordination function, i.e. a zero-sum game, then we will face challenges. And this is one of the preoccupations, obviously, in the system right now.
Thank you very much. I've had the privileged position of posing the questions up to this point, and I'm sure there are many more interesting questions out there in the audience. I'll start taking questions at this point, hopefully in the order in which I see hands. And I know many people around the table, but not everyone. So please, for me and for our guest, please introduce yourself and then pose a question, starting with Stephen.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you very much, Achim Steiner, for a very fascinating introduction. I was going to ask two questions.
Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, sorry, Stephen Brown. I will introduce myself by saying that I spent 23 years in your organization in various different exotic places. I'm now a visiting lecturer here, and I have been associated with a UN reform program, so I'm very fascinated by what's coming out of New York right now. The first question I was going to ask you was to say how you would describe UNDP now that it's lost its coordination role. And I say that because I had a colleague who was long serving in UNDP as well. When he was asked what he did for a job, he said he worked for UNICEF, which wasn't true, but it was something which he could easily describe. You have attempted to describe what UNDP is going to do, but I dare say it would take much longer than 10 seconds in an elevator. But I'm very fascinated by what you had to say nevertheless. I really wanted to ask you a second question, which is much more on substance. In 1990, UNDP suddenly discovered a role as the Human Development Organization, the single best UN-friendly development paradigm ever to come out of the system. And it got ignored, as we know. Malloch Brown always used to say, you know, when we added sustainable to human development, it was associated with a loss of 40% in our core budget. When we describe UNDP as empowered lives and resilient nations, it's also been associated with a similar decline from 1 billion to 600 million in your core. I mean, you say you're 13% core. Part of the problem is not the rise in non-core, it's the diminishing core. So where are we with human development? Because my quarrel with the SDGs is that it absolutely does not leave, it claims to leave no one behind, it doesn't. If the SDGs had been conceived around human need, human security, human rights, which they're not, but which human development is, we would have had a much more satisfactory, comprehensive, and inclusive agenda, which we actually don't have, I feel, with the SDGs. So I'm sure I provoked you enough. Let me stop at that point.
Take a few questions at the outset. We'll take 3. Yes,
Give
here.
me a chance to think of an answer for Steve.
Exactly. Okay. Perfect. Again, please introduce yourself.
Thank you. My name is George Papadatos. I'm the representative of the European Public Law Organization. Here comes the disclaimer that my views are strictly my own and do not reflect those of the organization. The question is, what are the limits of the reform done from the inside? I have followed the reform of the General Assembly in ECOSOC in New York a while back, and it was caught in the internals of the so-called intergovernmental process, where you had the regional groups, where you had the informal groups, and you had the Secretariat itself resisting reform. So I'm wondering as to whether there is, this question has come up, and what are the limitations. The second question is that several politicians get elected promising jobs, all kinds of things that come very much into head with the SDGs, with the environment and so forth, whether it is coal, whether it is gold and so forth. What does the UN have to say on that particular issue, where you have a conflict, you have conventional economics, you have politics, and you have damage to the environment, those trade-offs? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. And one question to close out the first round here. Yes, and then next.
Matthias van Hullebus, visiting fellow at the Geneva Academy, but I'm based in Shanghai Jiao Tong University. I think it was very interesting how you mentioned the different responses to global governance and also the underpinning norms which are affected at the same time. And one of them is more PR related somehow, right, to convince national governments of the necessary report about how multilateralism really works in reality. Institutional reforms as well, substantive measures, right, to align different perspectives. But I wonder also how you would see, or how we would define multilateralism nowadays, in the sense that there's more regional initiatives coming into play. Referring to the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, I think regions assume greater responsibilities, and how is the UN willing to engage them? Because their perspectives they want to complement. So what kind of role do you see for UNDP in particular?
Thank you. That's 3 questioners, 5 questions, I think. Yeah.
Shall I have a...
Yes. Why don't we take a first round and then we'll open a second.
Yeah. Well, Stephen, very nice to meet you. And I'm not sure I can describe UNDP in terms of the elevator pitch in Geneva, but in New York it's easier because you got 70 stories, you know, in a building, and I'm adapting to my new ecosystem. But at the end of the day, to be a country's, or to be amongst the most trusted partners a country can turn to when it needs to get advice on development choices. Because one of the things that, you know, I discovered in the past year as I traveled is that UNDP has almost a a slightly romanticized image in the eyes of its partner countries, its clients. It is an immensely trusted entity. It is an entity that has been there, often for 40, 50 years, through thick and thin. It is the institution that you can pick up a phone and say, I have a problem, can you help me? As opposed to being phoned and say, you signed this convention, can you please do something about it? Or you are not fulfilling a commitment here or there. So it is, in that sense, a trusted development partner and advisor, but in its portfolio of engagement, obviously, is quite distorted. I mean, 40% of the funding of UNDP today is centered around activities in 10 countries, of which 9 are conflict countries. I mean, what does that tell you? In Asia and the Pacific, the turnover is roughly $1 billion, and around 40% of that is in one country, in Afghanistan. So in one sense, you could say, well, it fulfills an enormously important function in places where the rest of the world really struggles to operate, and there is an element of truth to that. But to be the UN's development program with 3.5 billion people, half of humanity being in Asia and Pacific, and having roughly $400 million at your disposal to effectively engage, also leads you very quickly to conclude that something is not thought through here. So it is an institution that I think in its core actually has just received through the SDGs the perfect license for which it was almost founded for, which is to approach development in its very nature as a complex undertaking. Therefore, I don't follow you on the second part of your conclusion, because yes, human development, the Human Development Report, Mahbub Haq and Amartya Sen, and that articulation, that giving expression to a different view of development. And by the way, I don't think it failed, because it became, in a sense, at least a counter proposition might be the wrong term, but a different narrative to the Washington Consensus at the time, and a very powerful one around which many countries began to articulate their own development view. Did it, in a sense, stop structural adjustment? Well, not head on, but over time, it contributed to essentially abandoning that development era of policy advice that came out of the Washington-based institutions. But, to say it should focus, I mean, I do take your caricature of, sustainable took 40% and then empowered lives in resilient nations, which I don't understand to this day what exactly it means. It's our slogan. Yes, did I get it right? And funnily enough, a few weeks ago, I finally dared to ask the heretic question to my management team, should we think about this? And it was an outpouring of, finally. So, we've been operating with a kind of PR agency engineered terminology that essentially is meaningless to most people. Those are mistakes that happen in any corporate setting. But I think more important, I would not conclude from that we should revert to, the human development domain. Development is not just about human beings. It's about the relationship between human beings. It's the relationship between nation states. It's also the relationship with the planet, which, quite frankly, human beings are putting at peril in terms of future generations. It's about intergenerational equity. And so I think the SDGs, in their simplicity, at the same time capability of capturing both the principle of universality, namely for the first time in modern history do we stop separating countries by north and south in terms of actually addressing things that we can only address collectively. And secondly, with its integrated approach, however mechanical it may be, with indicators and targets trying to make the links across different dimensions, I think it provides a much more intelligent approach in which to arrive at successful development outcomes. And it also forces us to look at investment in one goal, no longer from this singularity agenda that has characterized development for so long. 1 minute it was basic needs, then it was education, then it was girls, then it was liberalization and debt. And every 3 to 4 years we come up with the next singular magic bullet. No, development is complex. It's a constant set of choices in which you have to weigh many different things. And I think UNDP must rise to the challenge of being able to advise governments in the business of government and governance. And that is complex. It doesn't mean that we run around, running hospitals or building roads, but we take the SDG lens and apply it to national budgeting. We help a government to rewrite its national development strategy in terms of SDGs and looking much more closely at leaving no one behind, because that slogan alone, as some have called it, has actually turned out to be remarkably powerful. Governments are investing far more now in data and trying to understand who is actually being left behind in ethnic terms, in religious terms, age, gender, geography, ethnicity, and thereby, I think, making it much more possible to make development not simply overlook entire groups or regions, which, in part is being driven by the challenge of marginalization, radicalization, extremism, which has opened our eyes to the price when you just leave people behind for too long, and too many of them. So, not to go deeper, but I would agree with you with the first 2 points, and I would argue very strongly that the SDGs are not a panacea. They're a framework. But in being a different framework, they have reframed the way we actually engage with our partners on development. George, to the point of what are the limits to reform, it's a bit like the laws of gravity. They never change. I mean, there are those who feel they're losing something. There are those who feel they're gaining. There are those who have to pay the bill, and there are those who will actually reap the benefits in perhaps better financing. So those forces are playing out, the institutional inertia. I would also argue that, the slightly self-serving conduct of member states, they desperately wanted a reform, partly to sell reform at home. And if the price of reform was that, elementary pieces of it weren't quite in place, well, so be it. It's the best we could get. It is now for us in the system to figure out how do you make that work. So these are some of the challenges, and the funding and the financing, I think, is going to be significant, because with no funding from the regular budget, we now are operating, first of all, on the assumption, and many of the Geneva-based agencies will initially struggle with that, a doubling of what the agencies pay for the resident coordinator system, a 1% tax at source for all non-core funding. So, DFID or CEDA funding a project in Malawi will in future be asked to transfer 1% of the project's value to a fund in New York that finances the resident coordinator system. We know the kinds of discussions that will happen over email and phones between, project and desk officer and these agencies. And thirdly, about $150 million that a number of countries have committed to as a temporary fund of 2 to 3 years to allow this new system to be implemented. This is a, challenging financing scenario, and I think in that sense, nothing new, but just a different context. But there is a degree of determination at the moment from the Secretary General to make reform a centerpiece of his legacy, and that's slightly different. Others have said we will do reform, but my legacy is going to be X, Y, Z. This Secretary General has put it front and center of his first 1.5 years, maybe sometimes to his own regret, but he is certainly pushing it very hard, and member states are desperate for reform. And in terms of the trade-offs, I think I go back to my response to Stephen. I think, if I may be brutally honest or simplistic, the era of trade-offs in the old sense of the word is over. And I learned this through something that I once led, which you briefly referred to, Jacqueline, the World Commission on Dams, or I think it was in the backdrop note, where I spent 3 years leading a international commission that was looking at the legacy of dam building, large dams. And fascinating, halfway through, or 3/4 of the way through this commission, which was composed of dam builders, dam opponents, I mean, it was the most impossible group of people ever to come up with a report together. The one thing that they agreed on is that they would ban the term trade-off in their report, because the odd thing is that the tragedy, not the success, and there are brilliant dams and they have delivered enormous things, but some of the greatest tragedies surrounding dam construction, either environmental or social terms and resettlement, was essentially that one group decided what the trade-off for the other group of people would be. And, not surprisingly in the political economy of development, the urban people who wanted electricity would override the needs of the riparian communities. the people who wanted to have the dam built in order to irrigate large amounts of land would essentially not take care of the very people who were resettled and paid the highest price for dam construction. The trade-offs were essentially the root cause of the problem. Now, that's not to deny that you have to do, and the word that they introduced in the sense of guidelines for dam planning, decision-making, was choices. You have to make choices. Development is about choices. The question is, if you say trade-offs, it's a kind of hierarchy assumed from the beginning. If you have choices, you create the right process, then an indigenous people's interest in influencing that choice will have a different impact than if it is simply traded off. So I think the same applies to the era we live in. You can no longer trade off GDP growth rates against the environment. And it's brought us to the brink of, disaster with climate change. It is putting us into a situation where water scarcity is now going to affect roughly a third of the world's population in the next 10 years, and so on and so on. I mean, I don't need to repeat it. So I think recalibrating the way we conceive of our economies, the development choices we make, is integral to the UN's value proposition that it offers. And here's to your point on how to define multilateralism in this day and age. I think it is on two fronts. One, I would not abandon the aspirational vision of the Charter. I mean, you can talk to many people who are skeptical and frustrated with the UN, but 90% of the people, when they see the Charter and they understand how it was formulated out of the catastrophe of the Second World War, that aspirational view of peace rather than war, we the peoples, I think is still a very powerful idea, and we should not just try and rationalize this in terms of governance and a machinery called the UN. And the second part is simply the imperative of being bound to act collectively in order to address these issues. Whether it's a pandemic, whether it's displaced people and refugees, whether it is climate change, whether it is cybercrime, I mean, I alluded to them already before. You cannot act in isolation from one another, and therefore the imperative of acting together translates also into, I think, a positive view of the United Nations as being an enabler, at least being a neutral or a more transparent broker of outcomes in an unequal world. I mean, that doesn't go away. And I certainly agree with you. I mean, the global governance agenda has to be both driven by a reframing of the public narrative, but also the UN has to prove that it is capable of reforming itself, and no question about it.
Thank you. I think we've got time for a second round, and now I see at least 4 hands. So yes, starting here, please.
Thank you, moderator, and thank you, sir, for your very insightful presentations. And we appreciate the role of UNDP, which play in field, especially 130 country. You have residence coordinators, and me, Bhuvan from Nepal, in my country also very benefited from UNDP activities, especially policy inputs to government and in field levels as well. And even Robert Piper, who before served in Nepal, he is here, and we share some idea even. And now regarding this 31st May resolutions, just UNGA passed last this May 31st. So I have some comments from your side about this funding mechanism. This is totally voluntary. So how it comes, and trust fund, there is also trust fund mentioned in the resolutions, how it works. And another thing, this is reporting, back-to-back reporting they mention in the resolution, and it's directly reporting to Secretary General. So how Secretary General will look all country report and order to the country team, you should do like this, like this. And what is the role of regional commission if UNDP country resident coordinator directly reporting to Secretary General, what role this regional commission will do? Thank you.
My name is Gerard Paltman-Kramer. I'm the permanent observer of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Mediterranean here in Geneva. Thank you, Mr. Steiner, for this opportunity, and it's good to see you again. Last time was in Nairobi. Like Stephen and I think one or two other people in this room, I've also been a number of years with UNDP, but that's already a number of years ago. You mentioned the interaction with humanitarian partners, specifically in crisis countries, and that, I think, over the last 10, 15 years has been very uneven on the one hand, and something that has changed very much also quite recently. Reference has been made to a new way of working, and I'd be very eager to know what your views are, and also the direction in which this is going. And it's clear, I think, that there's an overlap that has to be filled or bridged, and a better way of collaborating in crisis countries. In particular, I've noted in this context that you have a number of recent appointments in your organization that are humanitarian responders, including your recently appointed director of the Africa Bureau, who on top of it is a woman. But I think that's probably one way of going, of using the same people. But I'd be interested in your views in that in more general terms. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Eckhard Volkmann is my name. I'm the Deputy Director at the Inclusive Peace and Transition Initiative here at the Graduate Institute. So you said that you accompanied the development of an entire new policy with UNEP, and now you're in UNDP. You related also to innovation and how you expect your organization to be innovative. What are your concrete ideas on doing that? We're working here in an academic environment, and we like to contribute research into active peace processes, which is a very specific, narrow field of knowledge. And still we're struggling to convey what we think is innovative, and also to inspire people that work for us what makes you innovative. And I can imagine that working in an environment like the UNDP, that's an enormous challenge. And maybe it's an unfair question, but I think you probably have something to say to that.
I think we have at least now 3 more, so we'll maybe round up after that. So please. Sorry.
I remember you from 15 years ago when you spoke at some Good Planet exhibition proposal. So I have a very good memory and souvenir of this.
Great idea, never quite happened.
No, it's okay. My name is Delia Mammon. I'm president of an NGO, a development NGO that deals with education and with quality education. And so my question is somewhat to represent NGOs in general, not our specific case. We hear in your speech the challenge of money and the fact that the funding for the UNDP is being drastically rethought, and this, of course, probably concerns all agencies. And in the humanitarian world, the aid world, i.e. funding injured people in Syria, for example, because of the emotion involved, private people give. Whereas in the development world, we do such complex work that we are not able to collect this sympathy dividend. And so we rely more than other agencies on development funding from public organizations. What have you to say to that, please?
Yeah, thanks. I'm Dario Piselli, PhD candidate here in international law and research assistant at the Center for International Environmental Studies. I have a question on the strategic plan of UNDP, on the new one from 2018 to 2021. Particularly a question which I think is relevant given your previous experience with UNDP and IUCN. So there is an emphasis in the plan on nature-based solutions as one of the key areas in which UNDP plans to work more in the next few years. And I was wondering what were the governance implications of this, the emphasis on nature-based solutions, on social ecological resilience. Does it mean more central integration of the concept into your work? Does it mean more partnerships with the other UN agencies? Does it mean simply more project, more assistant on accessing GIF funds, or what else? Thanks.
Okay, and
Thanks. Hi, I'm Jonathan Fowler, the Head of Communications at the UN Conference on Trade and Development, and I interviewed you when I was a journalist and you were in charge of IUCN, so it's also part of the sort of, you know, looking back in time, indeed, it's a catch-up. So forgive me for a kind of communications question, but you mentioned what you call the abstract UN. I'm wondering if you see that abstraction as a result of our being siloed and jargon-heavy as a system, and what we can do as a system to actually make our story make sense without actually dumbing it down, which is often a problem.
Good evening. Thank you for everything so far. Ron Ockwell. I started off as a volunteer in UNDP a very long time ago, and I have to say I'm afraid that I resigned. But I then spent many years working in humanitarian operations, now working with a small NGO here on sustainability issues. I want to just come back quickly to the point that my neighbour here made at the outset in relation to the SDGs and the human needs side. Rather than the human needs, I prefer myself to talk about human well-being. And if one takes that perspective, which I think is inherent in much of what you said earlier, that to me actually calls into question some of what I read in the SDGs, which to me, to a certain extent, mix up ends and means. It seems to me that the goals are human well-being. When we start talking about industrialization and trade and some of these other aspects that are raised as goals in their own right within the SDGs, this is perhaps mixing ends and means, and I'd be interested in your view on that.
all right, that's a rather rich menu of questions to respond to in 5 minutes or so. We can go a minute or two over, I assume, if that's okay. But, you may wish to select. So.
Yes, just a couple of comments on perhaps this phenomenon of crisis countries, the humanitarian development nexus. I mean, now going back really 30 years, when I began my professional work at the time with GTZ, as it was called, one of the first sessions I was sent into as a young professional was a workshop on the humanitarian development nexus. So, I mean, it's a little bit, how to say, demotivating to think that we are still debating about the logic of having humanitarian response mechanisms, tools, resources, having to integrate logically with development responses and vice versa. I think my sense is, you know, intelligent solutions would do what the recent Pathways to Peace report that the UN and the World Bank produced in trying to describe, and if you haven't seen it and you're interested in the subject, I would recommend it to you, because it basically gets away from this notion that, you know, there's a kind of first responder domain that is totally separate from helping a country regain its development pathway. And it moves from a sort of chronology of intervention to much more of a kind of helix logic where, you know, at certain points you need just the absolute capacity to respond, be it after an earthquake with tents and food and water and equipment, and or after the tsunami with immediate you know, rescue responses. But then much of what happened next had really to do with helping communities regain their balance and rediscover their pathway to development. So I think in that sense we need to be far more mature. And you know, in UNDP we have actually quite a long tradition already of working with the crisis response in humanitarian communities. In fact, it was a whole bureau. It then got reorganized, and that's probably what you're alluding to. I took the decision recently to appoint an Assistant Secretary General again for the Crisis Response Unit because UNDP, I think, is a significant player in also enabling the transition from humanitarian to development response to be managed in a far more intelligent and coherent way. It's also part very much of the Emergency Relief Coordinator, Mark Lowcock, and I as the development coordination function in the UN Secretariat or the UN system, traveling together and really trying to take this new way of working, which is, another one of those terms, but behind it is common sense, frankly speaking. It's common sense. But, institutional terrains, the funding that comes in, it also goes to your point, it's much easier to get $1 million and truck water to a displaced people's camp for 2 years than to use $500,000 of that money and drill a well that will stay with that local community that was there before, is now hosting this displaced community, and will ultimately represent a development asset for these people. No, because humanitarian funds are, by rules very often prevented from investing in development infrastructure. You will continue to hire 10 trucks or 5 trucks who drive 20 kilometers a day to bring water to that camp. And this is the insanity of the way our systems operate. That starts with the donor funding lines. Then we have communities. I mean, humanitarians have a very strong sense of there is a humanitarian law and there is a right to deliver humanitarian aid, while development is there at the invitation of the country. Yes, it's a fundamentally important principle, but it doesn't mean that you have to behave as if you're from Mars and Venus, right? Which is how it often manifests itself. So we have some way to go to reset the incentives for people to act in a common sense sort of way, despite the boundaries that they're given and sometimes the rules under which they operate. On innovation, and I'm not sure I can answer the question of what does it mean in the context of maybe peace and peaceful societies and so on, but I think innovation should not be a cult, but it should acknowledge that you can either operate in a status quo mode and try and do better what you are doing, which is one paradigm, right? Delivering an efficient petrol station. It basically means you fill up cars and, you've done your job. Our work is constantly trying to find out new ways to address issues. And it's not just technology. I mean, there is one track that, can think about drones and software platforms and all sorts of other things, like e-government and biometrics. But there are also innovations that have to do with the way that we conceive of a different market for renewable energy. I mean, I was citing earlier on the dilemma that if you talked about, photovoltaic panels in Africa and private investors, there was just no way it was going to work. I mean, who was going to, put 10,000 panels in individual contracts with households there as an investor? And it just wasn't going to happen. In Kenya, the model of Uncopa emerged, which essentially aggregated the purchase of the panels and made the beneficiary, the user of the electricity, not the one who had to own the panel. And in a sense, it's part of our whole new economy that we're inventing. And suddenly you could get an investor who would finance 10,000 panels. The company would operate the panels, install them, and you have a pay-as-you-go system of buying your electricity from photovoltaic energy as a household. Revolutionary in many ways, both from leveraging private sector investment at scale, an operating company that would maintain the infrastructure, and a pay-as-you-go system using cell phone infrastructure in order to buy yourself the electricity you could afford for that day. It massively expanded access to energy. It promoted clean energy markets. And suddenly, something that was a problem that we had lived with for, decades was resolved through an innovative concept, a business concept around the problem. So to me, UNDP's work is not that we have, 17,000 sort of Silicon Valley or Shenzhen gurus sitting with our partners, but we are constantly trying to ask ourselves, is there a better way of doing this? And The power of UNDP, the power of having a country invite a UN agency is that it wants to access best practice. It wants to know, what is the rest of the world doing? How can we create shortcuts for ourselves instead of reinventing the wheel? And that's the business model in terms of substantive support that I think UNDP in part has always done, but is even more so called upon to do it today. How do you do it in practical terms? Well, we already have a project for a number of years that the Danish government funded in UNDP to simply look at how can we leverage technology as an innovation tool. I have now instituted a monthly innovation call, partly because you need to lead this from the top of the organization, where I invite 2 country teams to present what they consider to be their most interesting innovation that they have introduced. From a 10-year effort with China on hydrogen buses to remote sensing opportunities for monitoring land use in Costa Rica, where the competition, I only just learned that last Friday, so I'm citing it now proudly, half the world's pineapples that are exported are grown in Costa Rica. So there's enormous competition between an afforestation and a forest infrastructure committed country and land use pressure to produce pineapples, enormous commercial pressures. How do you find a pragmatic monitoring system that allows you to see if the industry producing pineapples is actually adhering to the rules of the game? And I do this once a month. It's live video, and you would be surprised. It's a system where you can just dial in to listen. On average, I have 900 dial-ins following these conversations, which means usually around 2,000 to 3,000 people, because there's multiple people who sit at the end of that, following these discussions. And there's an enormous thirst, because people are isolated in their projects, in their countries. Connect them, and the most exciting part is that the countries who have presented then usually spend 2 weeks just answering emails from the rest of the organization. Now, it's both an indictment that this doesn't happen as a matter of course, but it's also an immense reaffirmation to me that there is enormous potential. I've also initiated something called Project Catalyst, which is a small team of people who are essentially going to look 10 years down the line and further to understand what is likely to change the way countries will have to think about development in the future, and translate that back into how we can advise countries today to prepare for this. Artificial intelligence being just one example. Another one is Project T, which is Project Trillion, looking at how we get over this constant invoking we need private sector finance. Well, what on earth are we doing to help countries mature their domestic financial markets rather than wait for the World Bank or some wonderful investor who might discover that there are 49, 50, 51 countries in Africa, and help governments actually create the conditions where the capital in their own economy outside government is more attractive to invest in development purpose-led things. So you asked me how. I mean, it's just a few examples, but it's fostering a culture of innovation, allowing essentially the notion that everybody who works for us potentially is an innovator, give them the sort of support, the encouragement, and the connectivity across the organization, and probably live with the fact that 20% of the innovations will never see the light of day, which is, to me, a perfectly reasonable proportion of failure, if you're working at the cutting edge. A simple response to the humanitarian versus the development, yes, that is the reality. I mean, my colleague, who has now become the head of UNICEF, Henrietta Fore, and her life is so much easier in fundraising terms because she essentially has children to raise funds and she has children to spend funds. It's an immensely powerful image. Behind that, obviously, is a very complex and also developmentally oriented organization. We just have to accept that, yes, a starving child and the fact that you can give once and then feel good about it, and that's not to be in any way cynical, is an easier act of financing than investing in something that will take years to produce the results. I can only say, look at our world today, and you can trace the cost of not having invested in some fundamental things that define successful development. There are countries who have succeeded. Look at what they've invested in. And there are countries who are in the midst of falling apart, and look at the failure in terms of the cost of not having invested. And that is equally true for the international community. To argue over whether we should be increasing our development finance from the richer countries to the poorer countries is, to me, a luxury of self-indulgence to debate this. I mean, we have every reason to try and invest in the Sahel region, not from just a crisis humanitarian every 10 years drought point of view. We need to find a way in which, tens of millions of people can actually find a reason to believe in the future of their countries and their families staying there and investing in their country. If not, then you end up with the Boko Harams and the Al-Shabaabs that essentially just walk across the border and say, have you ever seen your state? Have you ever experienced your nation? Have you ever had anything that makes you connect to the government? And they will say no. I'm coming to an end, yeah.
It's your staff who's saying they want.
Yeah, I'm used to getting serious looks from Maria Luisa, so it's the price of being on tour. Just on nature-based solutions, very quickly, I don't think it's as much a governance issue, it's a demand issue. I think countries are increasingly confronted not just with the challenge of climate change, but natural resources, food security, water, loss of arable soils, forests, biodiversity. It is a naturally growing portfolio which the GEF, the Global Environment Facility, and others are financing. And UNDP has a global team that clearly has been very effective at helping countries frame their interventions. And in that sense, I foresee, if anything, yes, more projects, but it is already a significant portfolio. I mean, climate change and environment accounts for about 800 out of 4,500 projects in UNDP implemented or supporting countries in 140 countries. So it's a very significant part of the portfolio. And Jonathan, to your point, I don't have a solution to the jargon. I go back a little bit to this analogy. This machine is totally impenetrable to me, except I have a piece of glass on top that allows me to move my finger around and magic happens, right? I want to know about train timetables, there is an app that tells me that. I want to find out about the poorest people in the world, I've typed something in. The SDGs are our operating system. I think we don't need to reinvent the SDGs, we just need to think about the apps that allow people to use the UN, the concepts such as 2030 Agenda, in ways that allows them to address their problems and not turn it into some sort of recitational exercise. We will always have a strange jargon because we are negotiating amongst 193 nations with a scalpel where a comma is the difference between a treaty being signed or not. And this is not insanity, it is the unfortunate liability of the English language with its precision that allows you to turn a comma into either something you can agree with an entire document or not. And I think we should allow language to continue to be a vehicle that, yes, sometimes to the normal person is incomprehensible. And I personally agree that, some of the ad hoc, open-ended working groups and then, the rat's tail of tiles is just impenetrable. But the interface to the public is what should define a different form of communication. I think that's where we absolutely are called upon to relate to where people are. And on the issue of human needs and human well-being, again, I would argue that, yes, people matter, but I would rather look at where we are at today in terms of a more complex story. People view energy as something they very much aspire to. We sit here, air-conditioned, lit-up office, electric railway line running right beside us. Electricity is ubiquitous here. To somebody in Africa right now, having access to electricity is worthy of an entire goal in itself. And I think in that sense it reflects the diversity of realities around the world. I don't think we should spend too much time looking at the goals in terms of a logic, one is a means to an end or not. They captured the broad spectrum of aspiration that people are trying to address through the development perspective. From there on, I think we need to find intelligent narratives. I mean, Japan has long traded the concept of human security, for example, as a way of better defining our common future on the planet. my simple point would be, I can work with the SDGs because I see that they provide entry points for everyone, and I also see them as challenging us to do more intelligent development in future. Sometimes something is a means to an end, to another person is the end in itself. And I think we should not overjudge the SDGs on whether they get that logic end of it right. They are a framework. And beyond that, we will find different entry points. I mean, there are people in the world who think that animal rights are more important than human rights. It's just a fact of life, and we need to somehow live with this diversity and yet remain capable of acting together. And that is the challenge of the UN in the 21st century as it was in the last century. How do you help people come together despite themselves sometimes? And I think sometimes there are periods when it works better and sometimes when we really fail.
All right, on that note, I know we've run over the time allotted, but this has, at least in my view, been a fascinating conversation about the challenges facing UNDP, the historical trajectory which got us to where we are today, as well as some of the institutional innovations underway within UNDP. So please join me in thanking Achim Steiner for his candid and his engagement with all of our questions, and then his candid and reflexive responses. Thanks very much.